Nothing dramatic, but certainly a softer oil market generally since OPEC announced its cut last month, and we got a little bump, but ever since we've had downward pressure on the oil price. It would appear by the continuous outlook of a weaker demand forecast and economic outlook in the US in particular. But nonetheless, we've had some announcement by the IEA yesterday, revising their outlook demand upwards for the second half of the year. Neil Atkinson, former head of oil markets division at the IEA. Neil, we seem to be in a somewhat counterintuitive world. We've got OPEC and IEA forecasting bumper demand growth this year, and yet we've got oil supply, OPEC plus, cutting. How do these two things coexist?
Well, good morning, everybody. Well, when I was head of the oil division at the IEA, all the outlooks and forecasts were, of course, absolutely brilliant. And
they were right on the money, never off the mark.
My feeling about this is that I've felt for quite a few months now that the outlooks from both the IEA and OPEC are overcooked. I think they are factoring in too much demand growth. And at the end of February, early March, when I was in London for the IP Week meetings, I was struck by listening to various outlooks from private consulting firms, for whom I have great respect, which showed an enormous difference in the outlooks for global demand growth in 2023, from as little as plus 1.3 million barrels a day, year-on-year growth, to closer towards 2 million, the kind of numbers the IEA has put out. So I don't think there is unanimity here, and I think that some of the wiser forecasters are taking account of the weaker economic outlook with rising interest rates, China emerging more slowly than we'd expected, but still growing, but emerging more slowly than expected. And I'm slightly surprised that the IEA has kept such a bumper demand growth number in its outlook.
Jamie Ingram, senior editor, Middle East Economic Survey. I have to concur with Narendra, Jamie. I was expecting the IEA to revise downward their demand forecast, given the China outlook thus far after reopening was a little bit less than expected. But yet here they are raising demand forecast by 200,000 barrels a day, not an insignificant amount. That's somewhat sort of 10%. Your thoughts?
Hi, good morning, Sean. Yeah, I mean, I hate to be so consensual, but I think you and Neil are absolutely right. I was certainly expecting the IEA and OPEC to revise downwards their growth expectations, certainly not revise them up like the IEA did, although some of that was due to a downwards revision to historic numbers. But yeah, they're being very bullish on this. They're sticking to their narrative that, second half of the year, that's when the growth kicks in. China is performing strongly and will continue to perform strongly, it seems very strange when you look at the latest economic numbers coming out of China, which very much point towards a bit of a, losing a bit of steam on the economic performance there. And, as if you can just take China in isolation from what's going on in the West here. At the end of the day, a large part of China's industry is based on supplying goods to the West. Now, with disposable income in the West falling amid recession concerns, that's got to be having a knock-on impact on the Chinese industrial base, you would have to say.
And also, Jamie, we're seeing the oil price falling today, even though IEA are revising upward their demand forecast. Doesn't look like the market's believing the IEA too much.
No, absolutely. And as Neil said, there's a lot of consultancies, investment banks, etc., out there that have numbers. Certainly a lot lower. I'd say 1.4, 1.6 seems to be in the general ballpark from a lot of the figures that I've been looking at. And certainly the consensus from everybody that I've been speaking to is that, these Chinese numbers just seem way too high. And so that's definitely dragging on the oil price. It's just that nobody believes the numbers that's coming out from these reports at the moment.
Narendra Taneja, India's leading energy expert. Narendra, I wanted to get your thoughts on the story breaking out of Europe overnight that finally there does seem to be there's an EU-India summit in Brussels yesterday meant to be focused on tech and trade. but inevitably the sanctions on Russia and the India's import of discounted Russian oil being essentially a loophole inside the sanctions is sort of bubbling up as a possible divisive issue there. Your thoughts on where that goes in terms of that this future harmony between EU and India on this issue?
Well, the relationship between India and the European Union are very deep and strategic, and both parties know it very well. So the minister concerned from the EU might have made that statement just for the, he might be under some pressure, or it might be for some, consumption, domestic consumption. Otherwise, the fact is that Europe is still buying Russian gas, still. And the molecule of oil and gas is the same. So what is the difference? So that's why you see this lecture, if you want to call it that, has absolutely no credibility. The first they are buying Russian gas, they're still buying Russian products coming from different geographies, and it's precisely the region the oil prices are low. If they stop buying Russian oil and gas, the gas prices will go up further and the oil price will go up further. Then I am sure they know it very well. I think it's a political statement meant for a domestic consumption, because there seems to be a constituency within the European Union that wants, for instance, every single country to stop buying Russian products too, or the products made of Russian crude. At the same time, they want to continue to buy Russian gas and also Russian crude oil, rooted from different geographies. So that's the problem. I think it's more politics. But at the same time, you see that in Europe all across. I mean, you were talking about IEA. My sense is since the Ukrainian crisis, International Energy Agency has become kind of more of a political organization than actually an energy organization. For instance, the IEA chief is going around the world and saying, energy transition, actually, the whole process has got accelerated since the Ukraine crisis. While the fact and the truth is actually just the opposite. The fact is the energy transition has suffered severely. But they say, no, actually, it's got fast-tracked. So it's become more, I find that increasingly statements coming out of IEA are more political in nature than scientific. I think for the sake of credibility, they should go back to science and stop playing politics. I think this statement also on that, demand, supply and all that is I see more politics in that, more kind of building a narrative than the reality. I mean, they should go back to science, IEA.
Neil, do you want to comment on that? I know it's a difficult position for you, given your former employer and so forth. But generally, I would have to concur. We're doing a bit of concurring here, but since the IEA's 3 million barrel a day announcement last year on the Russian disruption, and they weren't alone in that, obviously everybody was expecting some version of disruption, but they do seem to be kind of sliding. I mean, I remember all the years, one would always say, oh, you can rely on the IEA numbers and not so much on the OPEC numbers because they were biased in their own political ways, everybody reporting their own numbers to OPEC. Now it seems the thing has flipped the other way around. If you want to respond to that or not, your thoughts.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I have no connection to the IEA, so I can say exactly what I like.
Yeah, I know.
My experience when in producing 62 oil market reports for the IEA was that never on any one occasion was I, as the editor of the oil market report, put under any pressure to skew the numbers one way or the other. Now, when writing commentary on the market, which was my little piece of authorship every month, yes, you knew there are limits. You can't overtly attack, say, OPEC and say a decision they've taken is going to destroy the global economy or anything like that. You can make suggestions that higher prices are damaging and put it in a diplomatic way. There are limits. So, and I understood that. My feeling about the current outlooks from the IEA, Sean, you alluded to the outlook for the Russian production cut that they anticipated. I believed at the time, and said so privately to colleagues at the IEA, former colleagues at the IEA, that number was overcooked and it was too much too soon. But as you said, they were not alone. And pretty well everybody has failed to understand the resilience of Russian production and exports, and the fact that countries such as China and indeed India were going to take advantage of an unmissable commercial opportunity. When Russian production and exports remain high, prices slump to at one point $40 below Brent, they're always going to take more shipments. So we didn't anticipate that. Nobody anticipated that. And Russian production and exports remain at significantly higher levels than everybody thought today. Quickly on the demand side,
Please.
I think that the agency has remained at the high end of the outlooks. There's no question of that. This month's number is slightly misleading because, as Jamie said, there were changes to the base, I think, for 2019 and 2020. So the increase in demand growth is not actually quite what it seems. But yeah, they've got issues with the Chinese numbers. When I was at the agency on 2 or 3 occasions during that 5 and a bit year period of time, we spent a considerable amount of time trying to assess what Chinese demand really is, because nobody actually really knows. And if you look at the numbers put out by the investment banks, by the consulting firms, the agencies, anybody else you can think of, and the number that they give as Chinese demand varies by at least 500,000 barrels a day and sometimes up to 1 million barrels a day because of differences of definition. And because China does not publish transparent, clear numbers for what we call demand in the same way that, say, the United States does. So there's a bit of wiggle room there, but the IEA remains on the high side. I do not believe that the numbers that the oil team are putting out at the IEA are influenced by direct political pressure from above. I just don't believe that.
Okay. Jamie, the other revised upward surprise this week was Europe's economy. Brussels, the European Commission revised upwards its 2023 economic outlook to 1.1% for the 20-country Eurozone bloc. I mean, that is, again, from the old, this recession is coming, it's only around the corner, to now revising up its growth forecast. Your thoughts on that and what it tells us about the, I suppose, the energy demand outlook for Europe in this year?
Yeah, Sean, absolutely. And it's been around a couple of corners now. I think people expected the recession to have hit quite a long time ago, let alone still just be lurking on the periphery. Yeah, a lot of this is definitely down to improved energy prices from the demand perspective. You know, lower gas prices have eased a lot of pressures here. Lower oil prices continuing to do a lot of heavy lifting as well. So that's always an issue that these forecasts can be revised quite markedly based on this kind of underlying data here. You know, the numbers are still pretty weak, let's be honest about this. Nobody's expecting a surge in economic activity in the Eurozone or in the USA, where the numbers are not looking particularly good either at the moment. Yeah, at the end of the day, this is going to be pretty anemic growth for the foreseeable future here. I think that nobody's expecting the OECD to be providing much relief to the oil markets in terms of supplying growth. Even the IEA is talking about this massive widening gap between OECD and non-OECD on the demand front. And I think that's something that, you know, you can tweak the numbers and point to various levels of anemic growth. It's still slow. It's not going to be a game changer.
Narendra, I wanted to get your views on the rather, so again, a podcast of surprises here. The loss of the BJP election in Karnataka, which is a state in India, southern India, much to surprise given what would appear to be a very high ratings for Prime Minister Modi in the national polls. What does this election result tell you? And obviously your party, is this a wake-up call? What does it mean?
Well, you see, Karnataka is a state, and if you look at, for instance, various state elections in different parts, the country, I mean, when people vote, they look at the local issues, the state issues, and not the national issues. So therefore, in Karnataka, for instance, BJP was in power the last 5 years, but people were not satisfied with the way BJP had addressed the local issues, infrastructure, corruption, education, health, and so many other issues. So they decided to vote BJP out and bring the Congress back. Earlier, also it was Congress party there. So when you look at this thing, and the same can happen as other states too. I mean, in southern part of the country, a majority of states are actually ruled by non-BJP parties. They're not like in Tamil Nadu, Kerala. Kerala actually the communists are in power, and Tamil Nadu is a regional party in power. These are all southern states. But it has depend, of course, how you look at it, but no reflection as far as the national governance is concerned. The same people who have voted Congress party back to power in Karnataka, chances are they will vote BJP when it comes to the central election or the national election. So that's very typical. I mean, if you study the data of last 20 years, that has been the pattern. The same people vote, for a different party when it comes to the local government, but when it comes to national government, they go back to the national party. So no surprises there. But that said, at the same time, I mean, the BJP needs to kind of get the message right, in the sense wherever they need to bring in more transparency or bring in more kind of improve the quality of governance in the local issue. I think they should do that. And it's a very smart, it's a party that works 24/7. And I'm sure that, those issues are being addressed as the country prepares for the national elections in the month next year.
Narendra, just to follow up on the sort of oil narrative in India, we had news over the last few days that the Indian government was removing the sort of extra tax tariff, the sort of that we saw on the oil revenues of energy companies in India. What's the thinking there? What impact could that have?
Well, it's simple. I think if you remember, post-Ukraine, when the oil prices started going up, first of course they went down, but they started going up. Britain was among the first countries to impose the windfall tax, and Indian government decided to impose windfall tax on upstream companies and also downstream, because they were both making good money. Upstream because domestic players, and but they get the same, they're paid on the same basis as the Brent, for instance, on that particular day. So this, and we also noticed that we are also net exporter of petrol, 06 countries across the world. So, and they were making good money, buying Russian crude, refining and exporting months ago. Therefore, the windfall tax, and it's all back to normal. And as you know, the Russian imports are in different geographies.
Let's go to global oil demand is set to expand faster than expected this year, with the most recent Chinese mobility data showing the country outlook continues to be quite robust. And given this average outlook most of it loaded into the second half of the year. So OPEC cutting into the first course when they meet next month, raise Tories in the US, as reported overnight by the American forecasts of the impact. But nonetheless, this is sort of return to business as usual when oil inventories rise, prices moment. It does seem they're at a comfortable 10-year average level.
Yeah, I don't think there are stocks around the world. We have some exports in April, I think was the month, or it was March data, with highest level since the Ukrainian invasion. Actual performance in 2023 so far. Stocks, I don't believe. If, for the sake of argument, the outlooks for demand growth that the IEA has put out, and OPEC as well, are accurate, that's year-on-year demand growth on average in the second half of the year of 2.5 million barrels a day change. That does imply a significant tightening in the second half, which implies that prices will rise. Would be this. It's essentially Southern days. Wiser councils within OPEC would have looked at this and thought, well, yeah, prices are going to rise possibly in the second half of the year, but we don't want them to rise too much because, as we know from the past, that has an adverse impact on demand. So wiser councils would have expected, wiser councils would have raised production in the second half of the year where possible to take off some of the heat from rising prices. Now, whether that still remains the case, given Saudi Arabia's apparent pivot away from the kind of close relationship it's traditionally had with the United States, remains to be seen. I'm not entirely sure, but I still don't believe that the demand is going to grow by that much year on year in the second half. So, we'll have to wait and see.
Jamie, I know at MEIS you guys track obviously most oil producers, particularly in the Middle East, in terms of outages and disruptions. And we've had now this disruption from the Kurdistan region for a number of weeks now. Every week it seems, oh yeah, it's resolved, and yet it doesn't get to restarting. What's the current outlook there, and other potential disruptions? Of course, northern Iraq exports about 500,000 barrels a day through to Turkey.
Hi, Sean. Yeah, no, the latest on the whole Iraq Kurdistan outage is that we've missed another self-set deadline. SOMO wrote to Turkey over the weekend saying, we've come to a final agreement with Kurdistan. Can you please reopen this pipeline? And they said they would expected this to have happened by Sunday. Here we are sitting on Wednesday, and it's still no flows there. So look, this is a political issue effectively between Turkey and Iraq. I think that a lot of it comes down to Turkey playing hardball just to try and get a better deal when it comes to paying for reparations under the court ruling a couple of months ago now. So that's a big issue here. But so they think they hold the whip hand there. But Iraq's kind of trump card there was that all the outages from Kurdistan, that comes out of the overall Iraq production figures, which are subject to OPEC plus cuts. Now, Iraq has never, up until the current agreement, Iraq has not seen any revenues from anything that's come out of Kurdistan. So they're very happy for these 400,000 barrels a day effectively to be shut in there, because it means that they can just ramp up production from the south, boost exports, which they have done, and they're actually pretty much profiting from this outage when you look at from the position that Iraq was in beforehand. So it's no skin off their noses, and it just means that when we do eventually see flows kick in, they'll say, well, we need to compensate for these outages. We've been overcommitted to our voluntary cuts, so we're going to produce basically whatever we want to going forward. So that will definitely take some of the shine off of these voluntary cuts. I'd say, just to add to some of the stuff that Neil was saying on the overall OPEC perspective as well, is an issue that hasn't really been talked about so much yet this year, is that oil burn soars in the Middle East over the summer. So not just that we've got these voluntary cuts coming in, but Saudi Arabia in particular, their oil supplies to global markets, they're going to be crimped, but just simply because they're burning a lot more fuel oil and crude oil in their power plants for air conditioning consumption over the summer months. So that can take maybe 500,000, 600,000 barrels a day off their exports alone if they opt to go down that route.
Would there be any chance on that? And again, it brings up my follow-up question, Jamie, on an update regarding the new refineries in the region, Al Zour, the Kuwait one at 615,000 barrel a day capacity, has had some stops and starts in its launch this year. And now we have the Duqm refinery coming, the Kuwait and OQ refinery in Duqm, which is a few 100,000 barrels a day capacity there. What's the outlook for their opening and getting up to speed?
Yeah, so as you say, Al Zour, there were some outages recently. That seems to basically be back on track now. Certainly both the 2 out of the 3 CDUs that were brought online, they're back up and running now. Exports are continuing pretty much as they were. It'll be a bit of a ramp up yet. They were planning to bring the 3rd and final CDU on in around August. That might be pushed back to later in this year now, just because they've had to focus so much on bringing the original 2 CDUs back online. But yeah, that definitely has a big impact on Kuwait's ability to ship medium sour crude to global markets, simply because they're redirecting a lot more of that to their refineries. In Oman, as you say, Duqm, I don't think there's going to be much activity there this year, effectively. I think, it's meant to come online in Q4, but then realistically commissioning works, etc., that's probably 2024 before we start seeing a big impact from there. The other one that people talk about, Jazan refinery in Saudi Arabia, which is operating but well below full capacity. Effectively, the Saudi refinery system is so massive that they're just going to, they can operate all refineries but at a relatively low level, or they can not bring Jazan up and keep refining runs high at older refineries. So we'll see that Jazan shouldn't have too much of an impact on Saudi refinery outlook.
And you wonder if the Saudis will avail of discounted Russian products over the summer to burn in their power plants, which might be an option for them. Narendra, last word for you with the survey result. OPEC maintaining robust cuts through the second half of the year, which would indicate some support for prices. We'll see if it succeeds or not. The survey results giving an overwhelming view that these cuts are going to continue despite the IEA forecast. How will that impact, do you think, this rather successful Indian economy thumping along at 6+%, sort of defying the global narrative, if you like? Can that continue with this continued pursuit of higher oil prices by OPEC plus?
Well, I mean, first, OPEC is a cartel. We know the behavior of a cartel, but it's a lot more about Saudi Arabia, and plus the kind of equation they have and they've enjoyed, which my sense is they still continue to enjoy, is with Russia, and that plays a very important role. But as far as our economic numbers are concerned, as long as oil is in the region, let's say $80 per barrel, then I think the Indian economy can absorb it and continue to grow. But if crude goes beyond $100 per barrel, let's say $100 per barrel, some experts are projecting, then we are in a slightly difficult space, because our economy is still an oil economy and we are heavily dependent on imports. In fact, our dependence on imports for crude has now gone up to 87.5%. And demand at the same time is also. So therefore, if the prices go, let's say, beyond $80, it will be very bad news for India. But India is constantly in touch with Saudi Aramco, Kuwait, and all the GCC countries, and at the same time with non-OPEC countries like the United States and also Russia, to make sure that the oil prices remain in that region. Let's not forget that only just before the Ukraine war, we saw India, China, Japan, and the United States joining forces. And they release oil from their reserves in order to make sure the oil prices are kept low. So that was the first time it ever happened. All these countries come together. So which means that the template is there, and if required, that might be used again. And
Narendra, do you view? I mean, we seem to have a divergence of views now between the two major multilateral agencies, the IEA, which we talked about, which you had indicated you believe they're kind of drifted into the political weeds, but nonetheless, they're forecasting a robust demand growth, and OPEC are by action forecasting a weak demand growth because they're cutting quite aggressively. Which one do you think is a better reflection? Because obviously it's all about where Asia goes. And India is clearly growing robustly. India or China is a little bit uncertain. Where do you think Asia goes in the second half of the year? Which of these two narratives do you support, IEA Outlook or OPEC?
This is a very interesting question. My with all due respect to OPEC and IEA and to Neil, who is on the panel, I don't trust OPEC at all, and I don't trust IEA. These are organizations created with a different purpose, necessarily transparent, honest, and scientific. I don't think so. These are both political organizations, and behind that is basically they want to protect the interest of the member countries. That's their job, and I appreciate that and understand it. But as far as the numbers are concerned, the research reports, I know Neil had been the editor and all that, but I don't trust them at all. And similarly, there are many other private organizations. There's some so-called big banks, some big, investment banks, big names. I mean, just study their reports in the last 10 years. They have heavily invested they trade and they invested. So I don't trust them at all. I trust numbers of only independent think tanks. Unfortunately, very, very few such think tanks who do honest work. These are all motivated. Some of them are political. So I don't any of these reports. If you are a country, you do your own work and you do your own numbers. People like me and Neil, we can do that. And therefore, I say the projections here, these are basically to manipulate markets. So those who trust them blindly, they should be careful and cautious. Don't trust either of these organizations blindly. Take their numbers, but then you use your own brain, use your own mechanism, put your own analysis into it, and then come out with this thing. But blindly, don't trust them. And also similarly, they're very big names, especially in the Western part of the world. People, once they say something is quoted globally, but I don't trust them. So as I said, unfortunately, there is no independent organization, a think tank, which is doing transparent, honest work so that one can actually trust reports or the outcomes or projections blindly. But there is no such institution on the planet so far.
Okay, we must leave it there with Brent crude oil trading down 0.5% this morning in early Asian trade, and 30 minutes together, and we didn't mention the US debt ceiling once. Maybe that's a good sign that we're not all that concerned about it, but we probably should be. Listen, thank you so much. It's always great to have the views of Jamie Ingram, obviously with me based out of London, Neil Atkinson out of Paris, and Narendra, of course, Taneja based in India. Great to have you on the show this morning, sharing your insights. All the best and have a good week. Thank you.
Thanks, Sean.
Thank you.
Cheers.